Dying seems bad, so why don't our bodies do a better job of maintaining themselves? It's certainly possible, since every time we reproduce, old cells produce young cells which develop into a young creature. Whatever the biochemistry involved, it seems like natural selection should favor creatures that don't just apply that renewal strategy to their offspring, but also apply it to themselves so they'll have longer to reproduce. So the question is, what's stopping natural selection from extending lifespans? We're going to build some simulations to try to figure that out. Our first mission will be to look at lifespans in a simulation without aging, just to let us understand the baseline situation. Then we'll try a few aging models to see what we can see. Hi there, it's me, the disembodied voice. I put my face in this one. Now's the part of the video where I try to pay the bills. You may have noticed these don't come out very often, and the basic reason for that is that they're a lot of work. Even though YouTube videos are free to consume, they aren't free to make, so they have to get paid for somehow if they're going to exist. The two main viable options are direct support from viewers and sponsorships. With direct support, you pay for the thing that you get, which is clean, nice, simple, healthy even. With sponsorships, some company who happens to have a big marketing budget pays for the thing that you get. Then the creator says nice things about that company's product, and then some of you, presumably, buy that company's product, reimbursing them for what they paid the channel. And you also get something, which is great, whatever their product is. And this can all be fine, but it does take effort away from the videos. And it especially takes a lot of effort to do it with integrity, making sure the product is actually good, that it's ethical, that it's not an outright scam. The point is, if you value the content and you can afford it, it's a great idea to directly support the creators you watch. And for a lot of you, that's someone else, in which case, please go support them. But if you do want to support this channel, I use Patreon for this purpose. Primer's Patreon could be doing better. And I think the main reason for that is that the tiers have been bad. So I made new tiers. The new $3 tier gets your name in the credits along with a Discord role and a 20% discount on merch, like these little blob plushies. This used to be $37, which, you know, some people did do, but it's kind of steep for most people. So I figured a $3 tier would make it more accessible and allow more people to be involved and get recognized for it. The only other tier is a $10 tier, which gets you access to a follow-up live stream 1 week after each video. And in that live stream, we'll dive more deeply into the video's topic, maybe even run some bonus simulations, and the agenda for that live stream will be driven by questions from patrons. And if that sounds interesting to you, but you're not sure, the first of these 1 week from today, or when this is published, that one will be open to the $3 tier as well, so you can check it out for cheaper if you like. But most of all, you'll be directly funding these videos, which allows them to focus on the science without having to involve some other company that might be fine, but none of us asked for. Anyway, on to aging. We start with a forest of mango trees. And because I'm extremely good at focusing on only what actually matters for these videos, I made it so the forest itself is generated with a simulation where mature trees make baby trees, and they're more likely to die if they're close to each other. But really, this is about the blobs. The blobs eat mangoes to survive. When they eat a mango, they get energy. And as time goes by, they use up that energy. If they run out of energy, they starve to death and die. But if they accumulate enough energy, they look for a mate to reproduce with, and when two well-fed blobs love each other very much, they spend energy to create an offspring. And the beards are just for fun and to add a visual indication of the blob's age. It doesn't actually have anything to do with their survival, but it grows as they mature, and then as they slowly approach 100 seconds old, the beard turns from black to gray to white. So those are the basic simulation rules. And again, our first goal is just to understand how to analyze the lifespans of these blobs without aging effects, aside from the beard. So let's make a bigger simulation and get it running. This graph shows the ages when blobs die. Whenever a blob dies, we check the age of the blob and increase the length of the corresponding bar by 1 unit. The longer this simulation goes, the taller these bars will get, and we'll have to keep extending that vertical range to see them all. So instead of just showing the raw count, we'll divide by the total to show the fraction of blobs, and we could interpret this fraction as the probability a blob will die at a given age. That is still coming in, so the values are still changing, but for example, this bar shows that a little under 40% of the deaths we've counted happen when the blob is between 4 and 5 seconds old. And it turns out this is how long their initial energy lasts, so if they don't find food by then, they just die. And instead of using percentages, it's common and I think slightly more intuitive to frame this as individuals out of a population of 1,000. The simulation contains more than 1,000 blob lifetimes, and they're not all in sync with each other, but the idea is that if we sample 1,000 blob lifetimes, we'd expect a bit under 400 of them to die at age 4 before age 5. So this graph is a good start, but it's kind of hard to see what's going on at a glance, so we can use this graph to make another more informative graph tracking the destinies of blobs over time. All right, so let's build this graph. To start out, none of the blobs die before they get to 4 seconds, and we'll show that by adding blue bars that go all the way from top to bottom. Then, as we noted before, a blob is at risk of starving after it's 4 seconds old, and a large fraction of them do die at this point. The exact number will continue to jump around a bit, but at this moment it's 362 out of every 1,000 blobs, and that leaves 638 remaining. This graph also uses red bars, and in fact they're the same exact red bars. And then up to age 6, no additional blobs die. I guess if a blob finds its first mango in time to live to 5, that mango also carries it through to 6. Then up to age 7, 56 more of the original 1,000 blobs die, so we add that to the length of the red bar. And these are still the same red bars, we're just adding them up as we go. And if we continue this process, we get the full graph, which has a fancy name. It's called a cumulative distribution. Cumulative just means added up, so now you know that word. The blue part of this graph also has a name. It's called a survivorship curve. It lets us see the basic story of a blob's life. So as we said before, it's very safe at the beginning since they have some initial energy and there aren't any predators or other dangers. And then it's very dangerous for a bit when they first need to find food. And my explanation for that is that the parents don't have any memory, so they don't remember that they had a child, so they can't possibly care for it. And in fact, they end up eating the food in the area, so the baby blob actually, on average, has less food around it than other blobs that have mixed into the population. If they do get to that point and they mix into the rest of the population, things get better. They still die, but it's at a more steady rate. And then by the time the blobs get to age 40, there's only 20% of them left roughly. And these graphs do have some data beyond the 40-second mark, but because the blobs don't yet age, they can last a very long time, and so I had to cut it off somewhere. It was here. Okay, so we're almost ready to start looking at aging, but there's one more graph, and it's similar to the first graph we made, but with a key difference. This first graph shows how likely a newborn blob is to die at a given age. This graph is for babies. This new graph shows how likely a blob is to die at a given age, assuming it has already survived until that age. So, for example, out of every 1,000 blobs born, about 8 of them die at age 30, 0.8%, which pretty unlikely. But that's largely because most of the blobs don't even get that far. If you're a blob that's already survived to be 30 seconds old, this doesn't really tell you how likely you are to make it to age 31. But this new graph does answer that question. So this little red bar is 3.7% instead of the 0.8%. That means that 3.7% of blobs that make it to age 30 will die before they make it to age 31. And we get this number by dividing the 8 blobs that die when they're age 30 by the 217 that get to age 30 at all. And so this original graph actually, we don't care about it anymore. I mean, we still care about it, it's been very valuable, but it's time for it to retire. So to summarize the blob's life, after their tumultuous youth, they have a pretty constant death rate. We could run a bigger sim to get more data and get some of these bumps to smooth out, but this is a mathematical way of saying that the blobs don't age. Or there's actually a better word than aging, it's called senescence. Aging is a pretty broad word, which can just mean continuing to exist as time goes by, but senescence specifically means deterioration with age. Most organisms, including humans, have increasing senescence, with the probability of death going up as time goes by. So our goal for the rest of this video is going to be to find a model for aging, or senescence, where natural selection leads to an increasing probability of death as the blobs get older. So we're going to introduce a gene for aging with 20 different alleles. Each allele will encode certain death after reaching a particular age. Allele 1 will encode death after 5 seconds, allele 2 will encode death after 10 seconds, all the way up to allele 19 encoding death after 95 seconds. And allele 20 will be special, it'll never kill its host, effectively encoding for death at age infinity. And of course, aging in real life is much more complicated than this, but we're just starting simple to try to get a handle on it. Okay, so we'll start with 100 blobs, and each one will have 2 of the alleles, and they'll die based on the average value given by the two alleles. So before we hit go, do you have any predictions for what will happen to the different alleles? It's very easy to wait until after something happens and then say, yes, of course I knew that would happen. But if you make predictions, and especially if you write them down, you can hold yourself accountable for what you thought you knew, which lets you actually learn things. Okay, let's pause for a moment to take stock of what's happening. So first off, the death genes that activate early in life seem to be going extinct. And in hindsight, it's not too surprising that dying early is worse than dying late, but we can be a bit more precise about why by looking at the destiny graph. So we have the blue and red bars from before, but we also have the new yellow bars that show blobs that died from aging. Right, so there are two kinds of death now, and we have some fancy words for those two kinds of death. So the red bars that show starvation, that's extrinsic mortality, which just means death from an external cause. And the yellow bars showing the deaths from the aging genes, that's intrinsic mortality, which is death from an internal genetic cause. Now, those two categories aren't perfect since many genes do interact with the environment, but they are things you'll see if you look into the evolution of aging. Anyway, if we select a random blob and see what its destiny is after 10 seconds, there's about a 50% chance it's already going to be dead because it's starved. This means that if a creature is genetically coded to die after 10 seconds, it only matters about half the time. And instant death is still pretty bad, so that allele still does poorly. But at later and later ages, the chance that a blob has died keeps going up, weakening natural selection further and further, allowing these later death genes to stick around. And that's the first big aging concept we've discovered. And really, it's the main one. It's the biggest thing. If you remember one thing from this video, natural selection gets weaker the longer a creature's been alive because other things might have killed it. So this is going to be a bit of an oversimplification, but basically, this is the reason insects have such short lifespans. Something's going to eat them anyway, right? They're just tiny little things floating through the air. They might even just get squished. So there's just no point from an evolutionary point of view of their bodies making them last a long time. They're just gonna die anyway. But more durable creatures like tortoises or trees can have very long lifespans because it's kind of hard for them to get killed, right? At least once they're mature, they're pretty durable. But again, that's an oversimplification. There's a lot of complexity in different types of life histories for different organisms. There's actually this paper here that I found, which has just this graph alone is super interesting. I'll link to it in the description. It's definitely worth taking a look at. But the basic idea that it's not worth trying to last a long time if something's going to kill you anyway seems to be doing a lot of work. And finally, this plot of relative death rates now also shows deaths from aging in yellow. And toward the beginning of life, the probability of death is mostly from starvation. But as life goes on, the deaths from internal genetic causes go up. And by the way, this came from natural selection. I didn't tell it to do this. I just said, these genes exist. Go ahead, and this happened. This was pretty cool. Another thing to notice is that the last bar in this graph shows a 100% death chance, which is always going to be true since, there's always going to be some world record age that someone has lived to, but hasn't lived past because they died. Currently, that record is about 90 seconds, and as we let more data come in, the world record will go beyond the limit of our graph, but it's always out there somewhere. All right, let's continue on with a bit more speed and see where things land. Okay, all right. So eventually all the genes die off except for the one with no aging. And importantly, that gene could have gone extinct early out of bad luck, but the longer the simulation ran, the more time it had to assert its superior strategy of just not killing its carriers. So this model did illustrate the core idea that natural selection gets weaker over the course of an organism's life. But natural selection was still able to completely get rid of aging, which isn't what we see in real life. So we still have some work to do. We want to find a model where aging doesn't go extinct. What else could we try? Well, one thing we haven't looked at so far is mutations. DNA copying isn't perfect, so even if natural selection is getting rid of the genes that kill the blobs early, mutations could be constantly replenishing those bad genes. To see how this might work, let's introduce a gene that has two alleles, One allele will be the normal allele, where the gene just accomplishes its normal purpose without any issues. Maybe it's for a protein that's crucial to holding the blob's skin together or something. But it'll also have another allele, which we'll call the mutant death allele, which stops working when the blob is 30 seconds old, causing it to die. We'll start with a population where all of the alleles are the normal version that works properly, and every time a new blob appears, there will be a 5% chance that it'll mutate into a mutant death allele. And the mutation can go in both directions. I should note that 5% is a colossally high mutation rate for the real world, but we're just trying to quickly test a concept here, so I made it real big. But before we run the simulation, we'll need one more thing. However common this mutant death allele becomes, it'll be kind of hard to interpret the results since we just won't have anything to compare it to. So we'll add another gene that does nothing. And this nothing gene will also have two alleles, which can mutate into each other. But since both of the alleles do nothing, we know that the frequency of these two alleles can only be affected by the randomness of the mutations. So that'll give us a point of comparison for this other gene that we're more interested in. Okay, so this do-nothing control gene has about equal numbers of each allele, which makes sense, right? Both alleles can mutate into the other, so if one's in the lead, that one will leak to the other through mutations, pushing it back toward the middle. By comparison, the mutant allele is hovering a little under 10%, so natural selection is clearly pushing it down to some extent, but it's still fairly common in the population. Here's a little pop quiz. The blobs are still diploid, so they have two alleles for each of these genes. Based on everything you see in these graphs, is the mutant death allele dominant or recessive? Nothing in this video has told you how to figure that out, but if you want a hint, support me on Patreon. You could look up Punnett squares. There's also a Discord server, link in the description, if you want to talk through it with anyone. Anyway, this introduces our second major concept, mutation accumulation. Even though the bad genes do poorly under natural selection, mutations can keep introducing them, leading to an equilibrium where there's always some bad genes present at any given time. So this is a step toward more realistic aging, but it's still pretty unrealistic. Most of the population actually doesn't experience that aging gene, and of course, there's way more than one gene that could produce bad mutations. So as a next step, let's reset everything and run this simulation again, except this time we'll have 10 identical versions of this gene. They'll still have a normal version that works properly forever, and for new blobs, they'll all have a 5% chance of mutating into the other allele. So this is exactly like the sim we just ran, except instead of one test gene, there are 10 of them. Each blob will have a pair of alleles for each of these 10, and they'll all work independently. So what do you predict? I guess there are three broad possibilities. One is that they'll not affect each other at all, and so they'll all lead to about 10% or so, just like in the last sim. The second possibility is that the mutant death alleles will interfere with each other, leading to each of them having lower frequencies than before. And the third option is that they'll actually reinforce each other, leading to higher frequencies than we saw in the last one. But which one? All right, so it turns out after we reach equilibrium, as judged by the control gene, not a single blob is able to live past 30 seconds. So aging is now universal, which is realistic, but it's a bit sudden, but it is universal and it is durable. Natural selection didn't get rid of it. So, it's not too surprising that having 10 times as many opportunities for aging resulted in more aging. But the striking thing here to me is that the mutant death alleles reinforced each other a lot. When there was just one, it could hardly get to 10%, but now they're all basically at 50%, just like the control. Selection is basically turned off for all of these genes. Whether a blob has a normal version or a mutant death version for a given gene, it doesn't really matter since it's extremely likely to have at least one of the other mutant death alleles, so it'll die anyway. So we can add this to our first big concept. Natural selection isn't just weakened by external sources of mortality, but also by other internal sources of mortality. And of course, this is a super extreme situation, right? Like we said earlier, 5% is an enormous mutation rate, and there's only 10 genes, and we end up with a population with a hard age cap. There's a lot about this that isn't very convincing. So now that we've used an extreme situation to see the effect, let's see if we can get the effect to show up in a less extreme situation. All right, so first off, in a real genome, there are way more than 10 genes that could potentially develop an aging-related mutation. So we should pump that number up. And as far as we know, there's no special rule for exactly how aging genes have to act, so let's allow a range for both activation age and for the death chance per second after that age is reached. Activation age will range from 0 all the way to 100 seconds in increments of 1, and the death chance per second will range from 0 to 100%, also in increments of 1%. This gives us 10,201 unique genes, each of which has a normal version and a mutant version that causes increased death chance. And these genes whose mutant death alleles lead to a 0% death rate, they do nothing, so they'll all serve as controls. As an example for how this will work, say a blob has mostly normal alleles, but for 2 genes it has the mutant death allele. From age 0 up to 10 seconds, it'll have no chance of dying from aging. It can still starve to death, but its body won't spontaneously break down. And then after it hits 10 seconds, it'll have a 42% chance of dying each second from its first mutant allele. And then, once it hits 33 seconds, it'll have an additional 80% chance of dying from its second mutant allele. And the effect of each allele is checked separately, so they don't add together to get a 122% chance. Instead, the blob has a 58% chance to survive its first allele's effects, and then if it survives, it then has a 20% chance to survive the second allele's effects. And we can multiply those two to get an 11.6% chance of survival, which is an 88.4% death chance. We don't actually need to do those probability calculations since the simulation just checks one thing at a time, but hey, now you know how it works. Another thing we should do to make it more realistic is to lower the mutation rate. And full disclosure here, I tried a bunch of numbers until I found something that seemed to work. If the mutation rate is too low, nothing happens for a very long time. But if it's too high, the blob genome sort of disintegrates, right? If we kept 5%, for example, there would be about 1,000 new bad mutations for every new blob, and they go extinct very quickly with that setting. So the rate where I found a medium sort of effect was for every reproduction, every allele has a 1 in 100,000 or 0.001% chance of mutating, or 10 to the minus 5, which is still pretty high compared to real values, which tend to be more in the 10 to the minus 9 range, though they seem to vary a lot depending on the context and the type of mutation. And anyway, we're not trying to prove anything quantitative here. It's just a conceptual proof of a concept that has to fit in a YouTube video, but I thought it was interesting to check it against the real rates. To track the frequency of the mutant death alleles, we'll use a 3D graph with activation on one axis, death chance per second on another, and the bar heights will show the frequency of the corresponding death allele. And again, we'll start the population with no death alleles, so any that appear will have to come from those somewhat rare mutations. Okay, now we're about ready to start, but as always, it's worth trying to predict ahead of time what you think will happen. So first, how do you think the alleles will do? And second, try to describe what you think the various graphs will look like. Okay, while this simulation is running, I want to clarify something about the phrase mutation accumulation. Here we're talking about mutations that happen in the process of reproduction, and those mutations get passed on and mixed into the blob population's gene pool. There's another sense of the term mutation accumulation, which is about the accumulation of mutations in body cells or somatic cells in an individual, and those don't get passed on. And that's also related to aging, but it's more about how aging happens in an individual than it is about how it affects the whole gene pool, and it's not what we're talking about here. Okay, so this is pretty interesting. When I first got this result, I was like, wife, come look at this! And she was very supportive. Some of the death alleles actually take over the population, and this happened even though natural selection opposes all of them, which kind of seems weird. So there's several forces that can push an allele frequency in one direction or the other. One is natural selection, but as we've already seen, that's weak for effects late in life, which is the case for many of these. There's also mutations, which we saw in the last few sims, but that's really only a relevant force on allele frequency if the mutation rates are unrealistically high. In real life, and in this most recent simulation, mutations can cause an allele to exist, but they're a bit too rare to drive the frequency of alleles. Finally, there's just luck. A blob with a new mutation might do well for reasons completely unrelated to that mutation, and its descendants might also do well, again, for no particular reason. Luck is most relevant with small numbers, and there's only about 100 blobs at a time in this sim, so it's not super likely for an allele to take over by luck, but it's totally possible, and with many genes that have an opportunity to do so, you're bound to see one. And we did. And to throw a few biology words at you, taking over a population and becoming the only allele for a particular gene is called fixation, or reaching fixation. And the technical term for an allele frequency changing by luck is genetic drift. We're not going to dwell on drift right now, but it is something I've started to appreciate more and more over the years of making these biology sims. A common misconception is that everything we see in biology must have some evolutionary explanation. Every trait we see must have been good for something at some point. But it turns out a lot of things are just luck. And the other cool thing about this result is that it yields a smoother increase in the chance of death as the blobs get older. It's a ramp. Amazing. So I can't say enough that real aging is super complicated and this model is very simple, but I was pretty excited to see this result. If you can't tell, it actually looks like real aging. We can add this to our second big concept. Mutations provide a constant source of new issues, and since there are many, many genes that could potentially mutate to contribute to aging, even a low mutation rate can result in multiple bad genes that take over the population through luck or genetic drift. Okay, so we've established these two reasons why aging genes might stick around. At least in these simulations, it appears these concepts are sufficient to produce somewhat realistic aging. Natural selection doesn't get rid of aging, and every creature is subject to aging if it lives long enough. And the probability of dying at each age goes up later in life. Pretty realistic, but these aren't quite the whole story. Is it possible that aging genes could actually be favored by natural selection? There's an idea for this called antagonistic
pleiotropy.
Pleiotropy is when one gene has multiple effects, and antagonistic means in opposition. So this is just a fancy way of saying when a gene has multiple effects that oppose each other. In the context of aging, the idea is that a gene that negatively affects an individual's survival in the long run could still be favored by natural selection if it has a beneficial effect on reproduction early in life. So let's try to make a version of that. Let's say this gene affects the operation of the blob's muscles. This gene will have two alleles. The first allele will be the normal version where the blobs have the same speed they've had this entire video. But then there will be a mutant allele that causes the muscles to work in overdrive, which will have two effects, one positive and one negative. The positive effect will be to double the creature's speed, which is pretty extreme, but again, we're just making a proof of concept illustration. And the second effect of the gene will be to add a 5% death chance per second, starting at the very beginning of life. Maybe the muscles don't get enough rest, or maybe the blob is more likely to injure itself by moving so quickly, or something. So let's see how it goes in a simulation. Yep, as you might have expected from how I framed it, the antagonistically pleiotropic allele did take over the population. As we saw earlier, it's true that natural selection favors maintaining bodies to expand reproduction, all things equal, but in the end, it's just about the number of offspring over a lifetime. So if an allele leads to more offspring but shorter lives, that's fine by natural selection. And since something else might kill you later, reproduction early is more valuable than reproduction late. In a probabilistic sense though, right? If the late reproduction actually does happen, it's still great, it's just that it might not because you might be dead. I tried to find some real world examples of this. It turns out to be pretty hard to verify an instance of antagonistic pleiotropy, essentially because experimental biology is stupid complicated, but there is one interesting paper I found that discusses what seems to be a real case. The basic idea is that there's a gene called p53 that plays a role in interrupting cell proliferation, which is good if you want to prevent cancer, but it's bad if you want to renew your tissues over time. So it has that trade-off. I'll link to that paper as well. That one gets pretty technical, but it's there if you want to check it out. All right, so let's revisit our key concepts again. The biggest concept is that for any given allele, natural selection becomes weaker later in life because you might already be dead from some other reason. And this central principle leads to two main mechanisms for the evolution of aging. There's mutation accumulation, where the luck of mutations and genetic drift can overtake the weakened natural selection, and antagonistic pleiotropy, where natural selection actually favors alleles for aging as long as there's a benefit to reproduction that makes the trade-off worthwhile. So that's the main thing I have for you, but if you're interested in learning more about aging science and research, there's a few things I want to point you toward. First of all, shout outs to places that make scientific papers publicly available. There's several links in the description to papers I referenced in the video. Most of them are written by specialists for specialists, so they're pretty dense, but there is one that's meant for a general audience. It's a printed version of a lecture from 1951 by Peter Medawar, who's credited as the first person to present mutation accumulation. It's actually a nice, comfy read. Second, there's a guy named Andrew Steele. Andrew wrote a book called Ageless, which goes a lot more into the history of aging science and also current research, and many more biological details, aside from the theoretical stuff we talked about in this video. He didn't pay me to say this, nobody did. In fact, he doesn't know that I'm finishing this video. He actually helped me understand some of this stuff initially when I was working on a script a few years ago. He doesn't know I'm finishing the video or recommending his book, but anyway, it is a book that I enjoyed, and if you're interested in more about the topic, you might be interested as well. He also has a YouTube channel where he talks about aging, but also some other health-related topics, so he's worth checking out. And third, there's a company called Loyal, which is working on prescription medicines for extending the healthy lifespan of dogs. They're at the clinical trial phase, and they're actually still enrolling senior dogs in their study, which you can find out more about on loyal.com. They're expecting to bring their first product to market by the end of 2025. Again, nobody paid me to say this. This is just a company that I think is doing something really cool. I'll be keeping an eye on them, so I thought I'd let you know about them as well. All right, that's it. Thanks again, especially to the patrons who decided to support even with the old bad tiers. And there's new tiers, if you, again, just to remind you, and I'll see you soon. This is my first time talking into a teleprompter. I hope you found it less cringe than I did.